She nailed curved roofing tin behind her stove. Elias Hovda, who had hauled freight across 11 Dakota winters and buried his first wife and 2 children to the cold of 73, told her plainly, "When the first true storm shuts the road, that wall will warm no child, and you will bury one before spring." She had $23, 2 children under 10, and 1.5 cords of scrap wood against a winter that demanded 6. On January 12, 1881, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours and buried the road under drifts. Beat. But 3 months earlier, Ragna Tveit had never built anything larger than a chicken coop in her life. She had arrived in Kingsbury County in August of 1879 with a husband, 2 children, and the kind of hope that belonged to people who had never wintered on the open prairie. 14 months later, in October of 1880, Ragna Tveit stood alone in a 12 by 16-foot claim, shanty built of rough plank and tar paper, watching her 8-year-old daughter Inga stuff rags into a crack between 2 wall boards, while the wind outside made sounds like a man dragging a rake across sheet metal. Her husband Anders had been dead since May. A wagon tongue had snapped on a grade outside of town, the box had rolled, and a broken rib had turned septic within the week. She had buried him on the south edge of the claim with a wooden cross that already leaned eastward from the constant wind. The claim was hers now. The filing rights, the shack, the milk cow, the cast iron stove bolted to the floor near the north wall, and $43 of debt at Bruins Mercantile that would come due before spring. She could not leave. Walking away meant forfeiting the filing, losing the only asset she could imagine leaving her children, and arriving somewhere else with nothing but 2 small mouths and whatever she could carry. The nearest relatives were in Minnesota, 400 miles east, and she had no team, no wagon, and no money for passage. The mathematics of escape were as brutal as the mathematics of staying. So she stayed, and now October had come, and the first hard frost had already killed the garden, and the woodpile behind the shack held roughly 1.5 cords of mixed cottonwood and scavenged lumber. Enough, maybe, to heat a well-built house through part of a mild winter. This was not a well-built house, and no one was predicting a mild winter. Ragna pressed her palm flat against the north wall, feeling the cold bleeding through the boards, even with the stove burning. The wall was single-thickness planking with tar paper nailed over it and a banking of cut sod piled against the outside. It had been meant as a summer shelter while Anders built something better. He had died before something better existed. She had $23 left after paying the flour bill, the lamp oil, and the interest on the seed debt. $23, 2 children, and a stove that ate wood like a starving animal, while half the room stayed cold enough to see her breath. The door opened without a knock. Elias Hovda stepped inside, bringing the smell of wood smoke and horse sweat with him. He was 54 years old, built like a barrel stave, and he had survived 11 winters hauling freight across the prairie between Brookings and Fort Pierre. He had also buried his first wife and 2 children during the winter of 1873, though he did not speak of it unless he was trying to frighten someone into leaving. He was here to frighten her into leaving. "Heard you were staying," Hovda said. He did not remove his hat. He looked at the stove, then at the wall behind it, then at the crack Inga was stuffing with rags. "I am staying," Ragna said. Hovdi walked the room slowly. He tapped the stovepipe with one knuckle, listening to the ring of the metal. He pressed his hand against the north wall the same way Ragna had, and she saw his jaw tighten when he felt the cold. "How much wood you have?" he asked. 1.5 cords, perhaps a bit more." Hovda laughed. It was not a kind sound. 1.5 cords in a shack that leaks like a sieve. With a stove set so close to that wall, it might as well be heating the snow. He crouched beside the woodpile and pulled out a piece of scavenged lumber, examining it. "Cottonwood and scraps. Half of this will burn fast and hot, and give you nothing but ash. The other half is too green to catch proper." He stood and looked at her directly for the first time since entering. You need 6 cords minimum to survive a hard winter in this shelter, maybe more. You have no team to haul. You have no money to buy. You cannot cut and split 6 cords alone before the snow flies, and even if you could, there is no good timber within walking distance. I know the mathematics, Ragna said. Then you know you cannot survive here. I know what you believe I cannot do. Hovda stepped closer. His voice dropped, and for a moment the freight hauler's bluster fell away, and something else showed through, something that looked like genuine fear on her behalf. Listen to me. I have seen what the prairie does to people who miscalculate. I buried my own in 73 because I believed we had enough and we did not. I will not pretend to care what happens to a claim, but I have seen your children, and they deserve better than freezing in a shack their mother was too proud to abandon. Mikkel, 5 years old, looked up from where he was playing with a wooden horse near the stove. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. His eyes went to his mother's face. When the first true storm shuts the road, Hovda said, that wall will warm no child, and you will bury one before spring. The words hung in the cold air. Ragna felt them land in her chest like stones dropped into still water. Get out, she said. Hovde shrugged. I have said what I came to say. Brund is offering $40 for the filing. It is not enough, but it is something. Enough to get you and the children east before the snow. Get out of my house. He went. The door banged shut behind him, and the gust of wind that followed blew out the candle on the table and sent a spray of cold air across the room that made Mikkel whimper. Ragna stood motionless for a long moment, her hands trembling. Then she crossed to the stove, opened the iron door, and fed in 2 more pieces of the cottonwood that would burn too fast and give her nothing but ash. The stove roared. The front of the room grew warm, and 6 feet behind her, the walls stayed cold enough to form frost on the inside of the boards. The question that kept her awake that night was not whether Hovda was right. The question was whether there existed any variable she had not yet considered. More wood was impossible. She had calculated it a dozen ways. Even if she could locate timber, she had no team to drag it. Even if she could drag it, she had no one to help split it. Even if she could split it, there was not enough time before the first real snow. The mathematics were not cruel because they were wrong. They were cruel because they were correct. More stove was impossible. A larger stove would eat more fuel, not less. A second stove would require a second pipe and more fuel still. The answer was not in the fire itself. Better walls were impossible. She had no lumber, no money for lumber, and no skill to rebuild the shack even if materials appeared. The walls would remain what they were, single planks with tar paper and sod, leaking heat into the Dakota wind. She lay in the dark, listening to her children breathe in the bed they shared against the south wall, the warmest wall, the one that caught some reflected heat from the stove. The north wall behind the stove itself stayed cold. The east wall, where the single window let in gray light and gray drafts, stayed cold. Half the room was a different climate from the other half. Half the room. Ragna sat up in the dark. The stove burned at the same temperature regardless of which direction the heat traveled. The fire did not care whether it warmed a human body or a plank wall. It simply radiated in all directions forward into the room where people lived, backward into a wall that gave nothing back. She thought of something her father had done in his workshop in Norway, years before she had any reason to remember it. He had been a carpenter who worked on coastal boats, and his workshop had been a cold, drafty shed near the water. In winter, he had hung a sheet of bright metal behind his small iron stove, just scrap from a roofing job, hammered flat and propped against the wall. She had asked him why, and he had said something she barely understood at the time. The bright side throws fire away from itself, he had told her. The dark side drinks it. If you want heat to go somewhere, give it a bright wall to push against. She had not thought of that workshop in 15 years. She thought of it now. The stove was spending heat on a wall that would never give it back. What if the wall could be made to push instead of drink? Ragna rose before dawn and lit the lamp. She pulled on her coat and went outside into the gray light, walking around the back of the shack to where Anders had piled the salvage from their first months on the claim. Broken tools, warped boards, a rusted plow blade, and leaning against the sod banking, 4 sheets of corrugated roofing tin that had been damaged in transport and sold to Anders for a fraction of their value. She pulled one sheet free and carried it into the light. One side was dull and weathered, pocked with rust spots. The other side, the side that had faced inward on whatever roof it had come from, was still bright. Not mirror bright, but bright enough to throw back the low winter sun when she tilted it. The bright side throws fire away from itself. Ragna stood in the cold dawn, holding a sheet of a corrugated tin, and began to see something that might change the mathematics. She did not tell anyone what she was thinking. Not yet. First, she needed to test whether the memory was more than memory, whether there was any real principle behind what her father had done, or whether she was building hope on the wishful thinking of a frightened woman. That afternoon, while the children napped, she boiled water for washing. The kettle sat on the stovetop, and she laid a metal spoon across the top of the stove, with its handle extending toward the room and its bowl extending toward the wall. When she touched the handle end of the spoon, it was hot. When she touched the bowl end, the part closest to the dark plank wall behind the stove, it was hotter still. The wall was not reflecting anything. It was absorbing heat and giving nothing back, and the spoon closest to it was cooking in radiated warmth that never reached the room. She took one of the damaged tin sheets, a piece roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, and propped it against the wall behind the stove, bright side facing outward. She left it there while she finished the washing, checking the spoon every few minutes. The results were not dramatic, but they were real. The bowl end of the spoon was no longer hotter than the handle. The heat that had been pouring into the wall was meeting bright metal instead and scattering back into the room. It was not magic. It was not doubling the heat or creating fuel from nothing, but it was changing where the heat went. And in a room where half the space stayed cold, that might be enough to matter. She began to plan. The design would need to be large enough to catch meaningful heat from the stove's back and redirect it forward. She had 4 damaged sheets of tin, and the best of them measured roughly 4 feet wide by 5 feet tall. That would cover most of the wall behind the stove, but she could not simply nail it flat against the boards. If metal sat directly against wood near a hot stove, the wood could char or catch fire. She needed space between the tin and the wall, a gap for air to move, a buffer against direct heat transfer. And the shape mattered. A flat sheet would throw heat straight back at the stove. A curved sheet, bent inward like a shallow trough, might direct heat outward into the room where people actually lived. She sketched the idea in the dirt floor with a stick while the children played. A panel of bright tin, mounted with an air gap, curved gently to push heat toward the center of the room. It would not create more fire. It would make the existing fire work harder. The question was whether it would work at all, or whether she was about to waste her last good materials on a widow's desperate fantasy. That evening, Marta Nesheim came by to return a borrowed bread pan. Marta was 42, a practical woman who had homesteaded with her husband 3 miles east. She had survived 4 Dakota winters and considered herself an authority on what did and did not keep a family alive. Ragna, against her better judgment, showed Marta the tin sheet still propped behind the stove. Marta looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Ragna with the expression of someone trying to find a kind way to say something unkind. Metal gets cold in winter, Marta said. That is why we wrap our hands when we touch a pump handle in January. If you nail more metal inside your house, you will have more cold surfaces, not fewer. This is different, Ragna said. The bright side reflects heat back instead of absorbing it. Reflects. Marta said the word as if tasting it for the first time. Like a mirror? Like a mirror for warmth. My father used the same principle in his workshop. Marta shook her head slowly. I knew your husband, God rest him. He was a sensible man who built things that worked. This, she gestured at the tin sheet, this is hoping. Perhaps hoping is what I have left. Hoping does not replace wood. Hoping does not thicken walls. And hoping does not answer Elias Hovde when he comes by in February, asking where your children are. Ragna felt her face flush. I did not ask for your judgment. You did not need to ask. I am your neighbor, and I would rather say hard things now than attend a burial in spring. Marta picked up her bread pan and moved toward the door. Sell the claim to Brund. Take his $40. Get your children somewhere with walls thick enough to survive what is coming. I will not sell to Silas Brun. Then find another buyer. But do not stay here trusting a sheet of roofing scrap to do what 6 cords of wood cannot. She left. The door closed behind her, and Ragna stood alone in the lamplight with a sheet of corrugated tin and the memory of her father's cold workshop and the absolute certainty that no one in Kingsbury County would believe she knew anything worth knowing. The next morning, Ragna walked to town. It was 3 miles each way, and she left the children with Marta, who accepted them with a sigh and a pointed silence so that she could make the trip quickly. She needed supplies, wire, bolts, anything that might help her mount the tin sheets properly without setting the shack on fire. Brun's Mercantile sat at the center of De Smet, a 2-story frame building with a false front that made it look larger than it was. Silas Brun stood behind the counter when she entered, a thin man with a thin smile and eyes that calculated value the way a butcher calculated cuts. He had extended credit to half the homesteaders in the county, and he knew exactly how much each of them owed and exactly when they would be desperate enough to sell. Ragna owed him $43. He had offered $40 for the claim, which would leave her $3 in debt to him even after signing away the land. Mrs. Tveit, he said when she entered, come to discuss your account. I am here to buy supplies. His eyebrows rose. With what money? You are already $43 behind, and winter has not even started. I have cash for what I need today. She bought wire, a small bag of stove bolts, and a pair of tin snips that cost more than she wanted to spend. Brun watched her selections with open curiosity. Wire and bolts, he said. Planning some construction? I was not aware you had the skills. I am learning. Learning? He laughed softly. In October, with winter coming. Mrs. Tveit, I admire your spirit, but spirit does not heat a house. If you are building something that requires materials, you should consider whether the cost might be better spent on fuel, perhaps, which you are selling for twice last year's price. Brun's smile did not waver. Supply and demand, Mrs. Tveit. The railroads predict a hard winter. Everyone is buying. I simply respond to the market. Ragna paid for her supplies and turned to leave. At the door, Brun's voice stopped her. $45 for the claim. I have reconsidered my offer. She looked back at him. And why the sudden generosity? Because I would rather see you and your children safe in Minnesota than dead in that shack. I am not a monster, Mrs. Tveit. I am a businessman, and a businessman understands that a living customer pays future debts while a dead one pays nothing. The claim is not for sale. Not yet. Brun folded his hands on the counter. But winter is long, and you will remember my offer when the wood runs low and the snow piles against that tar paper wall of yours. $45. It will be waiting when you are ready to be sensible. Ragna left without another word. The walk home took longer than the walk to town, because she was carrying supplies, and because the wind had shifted to the north, and it carried the smell of weather coming. That afternoon, word spread through the settlement about the widow Tivite's purchases. By evening, the gossip had crystallized into something more specific. Ragna Tveit was nailing roofing scrap to the inside of her shack and calling it a heating system. The laughter reached her through Marta, who arrived the next morning with the children and an expression that mixed pity with frustration. "They are saying you have lost your senses," Marta said. "They are saying grief has made you build things that cannot work." Who is saying this? Everyone. The men at the depot, the women at the well. Silas Brund is telling anyone who will listen that you have nailed yourself a shiny wall and think it is another cord of wood. Ragna felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Let them talk. Let them talk? Marta stepped closer, lowering her voice, even though only the children could hear. If this fails, when this fails, they will remember. Your children will carry that memory. The widow who went mad and trusted roofing tin. Is that the legacy you want to leave them? The legacy I want to leave them is land, Ragna said, and the only way to leave them land is to survive long enough to prove this claim. If that means enduring gossip, I will endure gossip. Marta looked at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head and left without saying goodbye. Ragna watched her go, then turned back to the shack where the corrugated tin sheets leaned against the wall, waiting to become something that might save her children or might prove every skeptic right. She picked up the tin snips and began to cut. The first day of real work nearly defeated her. The tin was harder to cut than she had expected. The corrugated ridges fought the snips, bending and warping instead of shearing clean. By noon, her hands were blistered and bleeding, and she had managed to trim one sheet to roughly the size she needed while ruining a section of a second. She sat on the floor of the shack, breathing hard, staring at the mangled metal and the blood on her palms. The children watched her from the corner where they had been told to stay. Inga's face was frightened. Mikkel's was confused. "Mama is fine," Ragna said, though she did not feel fine. "Mama is just learning." She wrapped her hands in rags and went back to work. By the third day, she had developed a technique scoring the metal deeply before cutting, working with the corrugations instead of against them. The main panel was taking shape, 4 feet wide, 5 feet tall, the edges bent inward into a shallow curve that she hoped would direct heat toward the center of the room. But mounting it was another problem entirely. She could not simply nail the tin flat against the wall. She needed spacers, something to hold the panel away from the wood, creating an air gap that would prevent charring, and she needed to attach it firmly enough that it would not rattle loose or fall onto the stove. On the 4th day, a man appeared at her door. He was older than Hovda, perhaps 58 or 60, with hands that showed decades of metal work, scarred, calloused, missing the tip of one finger. He wore a coat that had been patched many times and carried a leather roll of tools under one arm. "My name is Torsten Kvama," he said. "I heard there was a woman building something with tin and struggling." "I am not struggling." The lie was obvious, even as she said it. Kvame looked past her to where the panel leaned against the wall, its edges ragged but recognizably curved. He studied it for a long moment without speaking. "You left the bright side facing out," he said finally. "Yes, the bright side reflects heat." "It does." He met her eyes. "Not many people know that. Where did you learn it?" "My father. He was a carpenter in Norway. He used bright metal behind his workshop stove." Kvame nodded slowly. "I worked on lake steamers for 20 years before the railroads killed the trade. Boiler rooms, engine compartments, anywhere heat needed to go somewhere specific. We use sheet metal the same way, bright side toward the space you wanted warm, dark side toward the space you did not." He stepped past her into the shack without asking permission. He examined the panel, running his fingers along the curved edges. He looked at the stove, at the wall behind it, at the distance between them. "Your spacing is wrong," he said. "You have no air gap. If you mount this flat against the wall, the wood will char within a month, maybe faster." "I know. I was trying to find something to use as spacers. Stove bolts, long ones. You mount the panel on bolts with the heads against the wall and the nuts tight against the metal. Gives you an inch or more of air space. The air circulates, carries heat upward, prevents hot spots." Ragna stared at him. "How do you know this?" "Because I have done it. Many times. On boats, in rail depots, in workshops." He turned to face her. "I do not know if your idea will work well enough to replace missing wood. I do not know if anyone's idea could do that. But I know you have built this correctly so far, and I know you will burn your house down if you mount it wrong." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I was walking past Brun's store yesterday and heard him laughing about the widow with the shiny wall. And then I walked past your shack and saw what you were actually building, and I saw that it was not foolishness. It was something I recognized." He set down his tool roll and opened it, revealing hammers and shears and a set of folding snips that made her own look like children's toys. "I have nothing to do until spring. If you want help, I am offering." Ragna looked at his tools, at his scarred hands, at the expression on his face that held no pity and no mockery, only the recognition of one person who understood something looking at another person who understood the same thing. "I have very little money," she said. "I did not ask for money." "Then what do you want?" Kavame shrugged. "To see if it works, and maybe to stop Silas Brun from laughing quite so loudly." Despite everything, the blistered hands and the bleeding palms and the weight of the entire winter pressing down on her, Ragna smiled. "Then we should get started," she said. "The weather is not going to wait." The next week transformed the project. Kavame did not do the work for her. He taught her to do it properly. On the first day, he showed her how to fold the edge of the corrugated sheet back on itself, creating a smooth hem that would not slice hands or rattle loose. On the second day, he demonstrated the spacing technique, long stove bolts through the panel, wooden blocks as standoffs, the whole assembly mounted so that air could flow freely between the bright metal and the wall behind it. "The air matters as much as the reflection," he explained, holding a candle near the gap to show her the movement. "Hot air rises. Cool air falls. If you trap the air, you trap heat against the wood, and eventually you get fire. If you let it move, the heat transfers to the room instead of the wall." Ragna asked questions constantly. Why this angle and not that one? Why bolts instead of nails? Why did the edges need to curve inward rather than lying flat? Kavame answered every question with patience and precision. He was not a man who explained things simply because he liked to talk. He was a man who had spent decades solving problems with metal and heat, and he recognized in Ragna someone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than simply be told. By the end of the week, the main panel was mounted. 4 feet wide, 5 feet tall, curved gently inward at the edges, standing off from the wall by a full 1.5 inches on long stove bolts. The bright face caught the light from the stove door when it was open, throwing orange reflections across the room like water catching sunlight. Ragna moved her chair 6 feet back from the stove and sat down. She could feel warmth on her face. She moved the chair 8 feet back. Still warmth. She moved it 10 feet back, almost against the south wall where the children slept. Fainter, but present. Warmth reaching a part of the room that had never been warm before. "It works," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended, almost a whisper. "It works somewhat," Kavame said. "We have not tested it against real cold. We do not know how much fuel it will save. We do not know if the mounting will hold through a full winter. He paused. But yes, it works. Inga, who had been watching from the corner, crept forward and put her hand against the panel, not too close to the stove, just near the edge where the metal was warm but not hot. It is like a second fire, she said. But it is not burning anything. Ragna looked at her daughter's small hand pressed against the bright tin, at the reflection of the stove's glow warming a part of the room that had always been cold, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the day Anders died. It was not victory, not yet. Winter had not even arrived in earnest, but it was possibility, and possibility was something she had nearly forgotten existed. Outside, the wind picked up. The first serious October storm was building to the northwest, and the temperature was beginning to drop. By morning, there would be frost thick enough to crack water left in buckets. But for now, in a 12 by 16-foot shack with a curved tin panel behind the stove, a widow and her 2 children sat in warmth that reached farther than it had any right to reach. And 3 miles away, in De Smet, Silas Brund was still laughing about the shiny wall. He would laugh less by spring. But Ragna did not know that yet. All she knew was that the mathematics had changed. Slightly. Possibly. And that possibly was more than she had possessed before. She fed 2 pieces of cottonwood into the stove and watched the tin panel catch the light and throw it back into the room, and she began to count the days until the first true test. The October storm lasted 3 days. When it passed, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees above zero, and the snow lay in drifts that reached the windowsill on the east side of the shack. Ragna woke on the 4th morning to find the room warmer than she had expected. The stove had burned low during the night. She had been rationing fuel even before the real winter began, but the air near the children's bed was not the bitter cold she remembered from last year. She held her hand out toward the tin panel and felt residual warmth radiating back, heat that the bright metal had captured and was slowly releasing even as the fire died. It was not much, but it was something she could measure. She began keeping records. Each morning she noted how much wood she had fed the stove the night before, how far from the stove the warmth extended when she woke, and whether frost had formed on the inside of the walls. The numbers were crude. She had no thermometer, only her own body and the behavior of water left in cups, but they told a story. With the panel in place, she could burn slightly less wood and maintain the same livable zone. Or she could burn the same amount and extend the warmth farther into the room. Either way, the mathematics had shifted, not dramatically, not enough to erase the gap between what she had and what she needed, but shifted. Kavama came by every few days to check the mounting and teach her more. He showed her how to read the stove's behavior, the color of the coals, the sound of the draft, the way smoke moved in the pipe. He taught her to bank a fire for overnight burning, packing coals tight so they would hold heat longer with less fuel. He explained why damp wood burned poorly and how to stack green wood near the stove to dry it before use. "You are not just fighting the cold," he told her one afternoon while they examined a section of the panel that had warped slightly from repeated heating. "You're managing a system. The stove, the fuel, the walls, the air movement, they all connect. Change one and you change everything else." "My father said something similar once," Ragna said. "He said a boat was not a collection of parts, but a single thing that either floated or did not." Kavame nodded. "Boats and houses are not so different. Both are shells trying to keep what is inside separate from what is outside. Both fail when you treat them as pieces instead of wholes." He helped her add a small angled wing near the corner of the main panel, a piece of scrap tin bent to catch heat that had been escaping along the edge. The improvement was modest, but Ragnar was learning to value modest improvements. Enough modest improvements might add up to survival. The days shortened. November arrived with a second storm, then a third. The road to town became difficult, then impassable for 2 days, then difficult again. Ragna tracked her woodpile with growing anxiety. The consumption was lower than last year, she was certain of that, but the gap between what she had and what a full winter demanded remained enormous. Elias Hofte returned in mid-November. He did not knock this time either, just pushed open the door and stepped inside with snow on his shoulders and doubt on his face. He stopped when he saw the tin panel. For a long moment, he said nothing. He looked at the bright metal, at the curved edges, at the mounting bolts holding it away from the wall. He looked at Ragna, who stood beside the stove with a poker in her hand. He looked at the children who sat at a table 8 feet from the fire, doing their letters on a slate. "The children are far from the stove," he said finally. "Yes." "And they are not shivering." "No." Hovde walked to where the children sat and held his hand out, palm down, as if testing water. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. The set of his jaw loosened slightly. "It is warm here," he said. "Warmer than it should be at this distance." The panel reflects heat back into the room. It reaches farther than it would otherwise. Hovde turned to look at the panel again. "This is what you have been building? This is the shiny wall Brund has been laughing about?" "Yes." He walked closer to examine the mounting, the spacing, the curve of the metal. He was not an educated man, but he had survived 11 winters by paying attention to how heat and cold behaved. Ragna could see him working through the principle, testing it against his own experience. "It might help," he said slowly. "I do not understand exactly how, but I can feel that it helps." He turned back to face her. "But a warm room in November means nothing in January. The storms that are coming will bury this shack to the roofline. They will block the road for weeks. Your stovepipe will choke with drift, and you will burn through fuel faster than you can imagine just trying to stay alive." "I know." "Do you? Do you know what it is like when the temperature drops so fast the glass in your window cracks? When the snow comes so thick you cannot see your own hand? When the only thing between you and death is a fire that never stops being hungry?" "No," Ragna admitted. "I do not know that. Not yet." "Then you do not know whether this will save you." Hovde gestured at the panel. "It is clever. I will grant you that. Cleverer than I expected. But clever does not equal enough. Clever does not replace the 4 cords of wood you do not have." "I am not trying to replace the wood. I am trying to make the wood I have work harder." Hovde considered this. For a moment something flickered in his expression, not belief exactly, but perhaps the first faint shadow of uncertainty in his own verdict. "The hard winter of '64 killed more homesteaders than any other season in my memory," he said. "Most of them had more wood than you do. Most of them had better shelters. They died because they miscalculated, because they did not understand how brutal this country becomes when it decides to kill you." He stepped toward the door. "I hope you are right. I hope this wall of yours works as well as you believe it does. But if you are wrong, if January proves you have miscalculated—" "Then I will have been wrong," Ragna said. "But at least I will have tried something other than surrender." Hovde looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, not agreement, but acknowledgement, and left. The door closed. The wind gusted. And somewhere in the wall behind the panel, a board creaked as it contracted in the cold. Ragna fed another piece of cottonwood into the stove and watched the tin catch the light and throw it back. 4 cords of wood. That was what Hovde said she lacked. She had perhaps 2 cords now, if she counted the scavenged lumber and the dried hay twists and the broken crates she had been saving. 2 chords against a winter that demanded 6. The mathematics had not changed enough. Not yet. But she was not finished. December brought the first taste of what was coming. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero for 3 consecutive nights. The wind blew steadily from the northwest, driving snow into every crack and gap in the shack's walls. Ragna stuffed rags and hay into the spaces she could reach and piled snow against the outside of the north wall for additional banking, but the cold found ways through. The stove burned constantly. Ragna rationed fuel as carefully as she could, banking the fire at night, letting it drop to coals during the warmest part of the day, but the consumption still frightened her. Each morning, the woodpile behind the shack looked smaller than it had the night before. She added to the tin installation. A second smaller panel near the corner that Kavame had helped her bend and mount. A piece of bright metal near the stovepipe where heat had been escaping into the wall instead of the room. Each modification cost time and effort and material, but each one extended the warm zone slightly farther or allowed her to burn slightly less fuel for the same result. Kavama came by during the second week of December with news that tightened the knot in Ragna's stomach. "The rail line is blocked," he said. "Drift's too deep to clear. They say it might be weeks before the supply trains come through." "Weeks? Maybe longer. The railroad crews are overwhelmed. Every time they clear a section, another storm comes and fills it again." He stamped snow from his boots and accepted the cup of tea Ragna offered. "People in town are starting to worry. Brund is charging 3 times the normal price for flour, and he has already sold out of lamp oil." "What about fuel?" "The same. What little wood people have, they are hoarding. No one is selling." He sipped his tea and looked at the tin panel with an expression Ragna could not quite read. "How much do you have left?" Ragna had been dreading that question. "Perhaps 1.5 cords. If I count everything, the hay twists, the broken crates, the fence posts I pulled from the old claim boundary." 1.5 cords. Kavami did the mathematics in his head. Against December, January, February, and part of March. "I know the numbers." "Do you know what happens when the fuel runs out?" "The same thing that happens to everyone else who runs out. But at least I will have stretched what I had farther than they stretched theirs." Kavame set down his cup and leaned forward. His face was serious in the lamplight, more serious than she had seen it before. "I worked on lake steamers for 20 years. I saw boiler rooms where men fed fuel into fires that could not be allowed to die. When the coal ran low, they burned anything, furniture, fittings, wood stripped from the deck. When that ran out, they sat in the cold and waited to see whether help would arrive before they froze." "What happened?" "Sometimes help arrived. Sometimes it did not." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray December sky. "I'm not trying to frighten you. You know the danger as well as I do, but I want you to understand what I am about to say." "Say it." "If the storms continue, if the rail line stays blocked, if this winter becomes what some people are predicting." He turned to face her. "You should consider whether there is anything else you can burn." Ragna stared at him. "Such as?" "Furniture you do not need, parts of the shack you can seal off and sacrifice, books, if you have any, anything that will burn and buy you another day." He held up a hand before she could respond. "I am not saying it will come to that. I am saying you should know what your options are before you need them." That night, Ragna lay awake counting the things she could burn if the fuel ran out. The second bed frame, which she had kept because Anders built it. The wooden trunk that held her wedding clothes. The books, 3 of them, that she had carried from Minnesota because they reminded her of a time when life was simpler. She could burn the chair by the stove. She could burn the table where the children did their letters. She could burn the boards from the partition that separated the main room from the tiny pantry space. Each item represented something she valued. Each item, if burned, would disappear forever. But her children would not disappear, and that was the only mathematics that mattered. January arrived like a door slamming shut. The first storm of the new year dropped 18 inches of snow in 2 days. The second, a week later, dropped another foot and brought winds that drove the temperature down to 34 below zero. The third, 3 days after that, lasted nearly a week and buried the shack so deeply that Ragna could barely see out the window. She climbed onto what had been the front step, now a buried mound, and dug a path to the stovepipe 3 times a day. The pipe had to stay clear, or the smoke would back into the room and they would suffocate. Each trip outside cost her heat, strength, and time. Each trip was necessary. The woodpile shrank. She burned everything as efficiently as she could, banking fires, using the smallest pieces first, letting the temperature drop as low as she dared before feeding the flames again. The tin panels helped. She could feel that they helped. The warm zone extended farther than physics suggested it should, and the children could sit at the table doing lessons instead of huddling against the stove. But the fuel still disappeared. Day by day, the pile behind the shack grew smaller, and the storm showed no sign of ending. Mikkel fell ill on the 15th of January. It started as a cough, dry, persistent, nothing unusual for winter. But by the second day, the cough had become wet and rattling, and by the third day, he was running a fever that frightened Ragna more than the cold outside. She moved his bed closer to the stove. Not too close. She was terrified of sparks, but close enough that the heat reached him directly. She piled blankets over him and fed him broth made from the last of the dried meat, and checked his temperature with her hand every hour. The fever did not break. Mikkel's breathing grew labored, thick and wet, the sound of fluid where fluid should not be. He was 5 years old, small for his age, and his body did not have reserves to fight infection. "Mama?" Inga stood beside her in the lamplight, her face pale. "Is Mikkel going to die?" "No." The word came out harder than Ragna intended. She softened her voice. "No, your brother is sick, but he is strong. He will get better." Papa got sick, and he did not get better. Ragna felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She pulled Inga close and held her tight, feeling her daughter's small body trembling against her own. "Your father had a different kind of sickness, one that we could not fix. Mikkel has fever and a cough. People recover from fever and cough." She hoped she was telling the truth. "But I need you to help me. I need you to keep the fire going while I take care of him. Can you do that?" Inga nodded, her face serious. "I can do that." "Good girl." Ragna had read somewhere, or perhaps her mother had told her, that fever needed warmth to sweat itself out, but not so much warmth that the body could not fight. The challenge was finding the balance. Too cold, and Mikkel's weakened body would lose the battle. Too hot, and the fever would burn out of control. The tin panels became essential. She could position Mikkel where the reflected heat was steady but not intense, farther from the direct radiation of the stove, but still within the extended warm zone. She could keep his blankets piled high without roasting him. She could maintain the room at a temperature that might give his body the conditions it needed to heal. But the fuel cost was terrible. Keeping the room warm enough for a sick child meant burning more wood than she had planned. The pile behind the shack dropped below a full cord, then below 3/4, then below half. Outside, the storms continued. The road remained blocked. No supplies came through. The settlement hunkered down and waited for relief that did not arrive. On the 18th of January, Ragna burned the second bed frame. On the 20th, she burned the wooden trunk with her wedding clothes still inside. On the 22nd, she burned the books. Each item that went into the fire bought another day. Each day bought Mikkel another chance to fight off the fever. Each chance was precious beyond calculation. The worst storm arrived on the 26th of January. It began like the others, wind rising, temperature dropping, sky turning the color of old lead. But this one did not stop. Hour after hour, the wind screamed across the prairie, driving snow so thick that Ragna could not see the woodpile 3 feet from the door. The temperature fell past 30 below, past 35, past a point where she stopped counting because counting would not help. The shack groaned. The walls flexed visibly in the gusts, boards creaking and popping like living things in pain. Snow packed against the north wall so heavily that she could hear it pressing, could feel the structure settling under weight it had not been built to bear. The stovepipe choked at 2 in the morning. Ragna woke to the smell of smoke thickening in the room. For a terrible moment she thought the shack was on fire, that the panel had failed, that the wall behind it had caught, that everything was ending. But the heat from the stove was wrong, the draft was wrong, and then she understood. The pipe was blocked. Drift had covered the cap. She had to go outside. Ragna pulled on every piece of clothing she owned. 2 dresses, a coat, Anders's coat over that, rags wrapped around her hands and face. She told Inga to watch the fire, to keep it low, to not add fuel until she returned. Then she opened the door and stepped into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall, not a metaphor, an actual physical pressure against her chest that made drawing breath difficult. The wind tore at her clothes, finding every gap, driving needles of ice into her skin. She could not see. The snow was not falling from above, but moving horizontally, a white river of ice that erased the world. She knew where the stovepipe was. She had dug paths to it 100 times, but the paths were gone now, buried under fresh drift, and she had to crawl because standing in the wind was impossible. Her hands sank into snow past the wrist, past the elbow. Her knees found nothing solid. She moved by memory and hope, dragging herself toward where the pipe should be. She found the wall first, the rough planks of the shack, and worked along it until the wall ended and something vertical began. The pipe. She clawed at the snow around its base, her wrapped hands useless as clubs, and climbed upward until she felt the cap. It was buried, packed solid. She could not clear it with her hands, could not reach it properly, could not breathe in the wind that tried to rip her from the roof. She screamed. The wind swallowed the sound. Then she remembered the poker. She had left it by the door. The climb down was worse than the climb up. She fell twice, rolled, lost her bearings in the white, found the wall again by feel, found the door by the faint warmth leaking around its edges, crawled inside and lay gasping on the floor while smoke curled above her head. "Mama," Inga's voice, small and terrified. "I need the poker." She went back out, up the wall, found the pipe again, drove the poker into the packed snow over and over until something gave, until she felt resistance disappear, until the drift around the cap loosened and fell away. She did not remember getting back inside. She remembered lying on the floor again, shaking so violently that her teeth cracked against each other. She remembered Inga pulling blankets over her and crying. She remembered the sound of the stove drawing properly again, the crackle of flame finding air. She remembered wondering whether she would lose fingers, toes, ears, whether the cold had taken pieces of her that would not grow back. She did not lose anything. The wrappings had protected her. The time outside had been short enough, just barely short enough, that the damage was temporary. But she understood now, in a way she had not before, what Hovde had meant about the prairie deciding to kill you. The storm continued for 4 more days. Mikkel's fever broke on the 3rd day of the siege. Ragna woke to find him looking at her with clear eyes for the first time in almost 2 weeks. His skin was cool. His breathing, though still rough, no longer rattled with fluid. He asked for water, then food, then asked why Mama looked so tired. She cried. She had not cried since Anders died, had not allowed herself that release, but she cried now, silently, so the children would not worry, pressing her face into the blankets while tears streamed down her cheeks. The fuel situation was desperate. She had burned everything she was willing to burn and most of what she was not. The pile behind the shack held perhaps enough wood for 3 more days, maybe 4, if she stretched it to the breaking point. But the storm was weakening. On the 4th day, the wind dropped. On the 5th day, the snow stopped entirely. On the 6th day, the sky cleared to a brutal blue, and the temperature, though still far below zero, no longer felt like immediate death. Ragna opened the door and looked out at a transformed world. The drifts had reshaped everything, burying fences and outbuildings, and the road itself under smooth white hills that caught the morning light and blazed. Her shack stood like a ship frozen in ice, only the roof and upper walls visible above the snow. And moving toward her, across the white, struggling through drifts that reached their waists, came 2 figures. She recognized Hofda first. The second figure was a neighbor, a man named Lindgren, whose claim lay 2 miles south. They were pulling a sled. On the sled was wood. Hofda reached the shack first, breathing hard, his beard white with frozen breath. He looked at Ragna standing in the doorway, looked at the smoke rising from the pipe, looked at the state of her face and hands and clothes. "You are alive," he said. "Yes." "The children?" "Alive. Mikkel was sick, but the fever broke." Hovda nodded slowly. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "We heard about the widow's shack. People in town assumed you would be dead by now. They were taking bets. I'm sorry to disappoint them." Something that might have been a smile flickered across Hovda's face. "Lindgren lost his wife 3 days ago. The cold took her while he slept. He wanted to bring fuel to someone who might use it." Ragna looked at Lindgren, at the grief carved into his face, at the wood on the sled that represented everything he had been saving to keep his wife alive. "I cannot accept." "You can accept," Lindgren said. His voice was hoarse, damaged by cold or crying or both. "She is beyond needing it. You are not." They unloaded the wood in silence. It was not much, a quarter cord, perhaps less, but combined with what Ragna had left, it might be enough to last until the road opened and supplies came through. Hovda lingered after Lindgren started back toward town. He stood in the doorway of the shack, looking at the tin panels, at the stove, at the children sitting at their table in warmth that should not have been possible. "I judged your woodpile," he said finally, "and I never judged where your heat was dying." Ragna did not know how to respond. She waited. "I still do not understand exactly how it works," Hovda continued, "but I can feel that it works. The room is warmer than it should be. The children are farther from the fire than any children should be able to sit in weather like this." He met her eyes. "I was wrong." 3 words. In the mouth of Elias Hovda, who had survived 11 winters and buried his own family to the cold, they weighed more than any apology Ragna had ever heard. "You were trying to keep me alive," she said. "You were wrong about the method, but you were right about the danger." "The danger is not finished. There's more winter coming." "I know. But you might survive it." He said the words as if they surprised him. "You actually might survive it." "Yes," Ragna said. "I might." Hovda nodded once, turned, and followed Lindgren's tracks back through the drifts toward town. Ragna closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the warmth of the room wrap around her like an embrace. The tin panel caught the stove's light and threw it back. The children sat at their table, Inga helping Mikkel with his letters, both of them thin and tired but alive. The worst was over. She did not know this for certain. There would be more storms, more cold, more desperate nights, but she felt it in her bones the way she felt the warmth on her face. The worst was over, and they had survived it. The shiny wall had held. The road opened on the 3rd of February. A crew of men with shovels and teams had worked for 6 days to cut a passage through the drifts between De Smet and the blocked rail depot. The first supply wagon came through that afternoon, carrying flour and lamp oil and news of how bad the winter had been elsewhere. Families frozen in their beds, livestock dead by the thousands, entire settlements cut off for weeks with nothing but what they had stored. Ragna heard the news from Marta Nesheim, who came by the shack 2 days after the road opened. Marta stood in the doorway, unwilling to step inside, her face showing something Ragna had never seen there before: uncertainty. "I came to see if you were alive," Marta said. "We are alive." "All 3 of you?" "All 3. Marta looked past Ragna into the room, at the tin panels gleaming in the stove light, at the children sitting at the table doing lessons 8 feet from the fire. She looked at the woodpile visible through the open door, depleted but not empty, and at the state of the walls, which showed no sign of the charring or damage she had clearly expected. "May I come in?" Ragna stepped aside. Marta walked slowly around the room. She put her hand near the panel, feeling the warmth radiating back. She moved to where the children sat and held her palm out the way Hovda had, testing the temperature at a distance that should have been cold. "It is warm here," she said. "Yes. Warmer than my house, and I have twice the fuel you had." The panels direct the heat into the room instead of letting it escape into the walls. Marta turned to face her. Her expression had shifted from uncertainty to something closer to confusion, the look of someone whose understanding of the world had just been proven incomplete. "I told you it was hoping," she said. "I told you metal gets cold in winter." "You did?" "I was wrong." The words came out stiffly, as if they cost her something to say. Ragna understood. Admitting error was difficult for anyone, but for Marta, who had survived 4 winters and considered herself an authority, it was harder still. "You were trying to help," Ragna said. "You believed you were giving good advice." "I believed I was telling the truth. I believed I understood how heat worked in a house." Marta shook her head slowly. "But I did not understand this. I do not understand it now, not fully. I only know that you are alive when I thought you would be dead, and your room is warm when it should not be." "Would you like me to explain?" Marta hesitated. Then she nodded. Ragna showed her the panels, the main sheet behind the stove, the angled wing near the corner, the small piece near the pipe. She explained the spacing, the air gap, the way bright metal reflected radiant heat instead of absorbing it. She showed Marta the spoon test, laying a metal spoon on the stove with one end toward the panel and one end toward the room, demonstrating how both ends stayed equally warm instead of one cooking against a heat-drinking wall. "It is not magic," Ragna said. "It is direction. The fire produces the same heat either way. The difference is where the heat goes." Marta listened without interrupting. When Ragna finished, she stood silent for a long moment, her practical mind working through the implications. "I have scrap metal in my shed," she said finally. "Pieces from a roof repair 2 years ago. They are not as large as your panels, but they might serve." "They might. I can show you how to mount them if you like." "I would like that." Marta met her eyes. "I would like that very much." She left an hour later with rough sketches and a list of materials. Ragna watched her go, feeling something shift in her chest, not quite triumph, but something adjacent to it. Marta had been the first to doubt. Now Marta would be the first to adopt. The word would spread. Over the following weeks, it did. People came to the shack. Not many at first, a trickle of the curious, the desperate, the ones who had heard the gossip and wanted to see for themselves. They stood where Marta had stood, tested the warmth where Marta had tested it, asked the same questions Marta had asked. Ragna answered them all. She showed the panels to anyone who wanted to see. She explained the principle to anyone who wanted to understand. She drew sketches on scraps of paper and gave them away freely, asking nothing in return. Some visitors were skeptical. A man named Gunderson spent 20 minutes arguing that the warmth must come from something else. Better stove? Better fuel? Some trick Ragna was not revealing. When she invited him to examine the stove and the fuel pile himself, he declined and left muttering about women who thought they understood things. But most visitors were not like Gunderson. Most were frightened people who had nearly died during the siege, who had burned furniture and clothes and precious possessions trying to survive, who wanted desperately to believe there was something they could do to make next winter less terrifying. To those people, Ragna gave everything she knew. She taught a young wife named Birgit how to identify metal that would reflect well versus metal that would absorb. She showed an elderly widower named Tolef how to mount a panel safely with proper spacing. She helped Marta complete her installation, then helped Marta teach 2 other families who lived near Marta's claim. The knowledge spread not as a single wave, but as ripples. Each person who learned becoming a teacher who could spread it further. Kvame watched all of this with an expression Ragna could not quite read. He continued to visit every few days, checking her panels, teaching her refinements, sharing techniques he had learned in decades of working with metal and heat. But something in his manner had changed since the siege, a quietness that had not been there before. One afternoon in late February, while they were adjusting the angle of the corner wing, Ragna asked him what was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," he said. "Everything is right. That is what troubles me. I do not understand." Kvame set down his tools and sat on the edge of the children's bed, moving stiffly. He was 58 years old, and the winter had worn on him harder than Ragna had noticed. "I came to this place because I had nothing left elsewhere," he said. "The lake steamers are gone. The railroads do not need tinsmiths the way they once did. I have skills that belong to a world that no longer exists." He looked at the panels, and now I find myself teaching those skills to a widow who uses them better than I ever did. "That is not true. Everything I know, I learned from you." "No. Everything you know about metal and mounting, you learned from me. But the idea, the principle, that you understood before we met. I saw it the first time I looked at your panel. You had left the bright side facing out. You knew which direction heat should go." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I spent 20 years on boiler decks and never once thought to use what I knew to save a family. You thought of it in desperation, with 2 children and no help, and everyone telling you it was foolishness." "I thought of it because I had no other choice." "Yes, that is what I mean." Kvame stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered claim. The people who change things are not always the ones with the most knowledge. Sometimes they are the ones with the most need. The knowledge just gives them a way to act on what they already see. Ragna did not know how to respond. She had never thought of herself as someone who changed things. She had thought of herself as someone trying not to die. "You should be the one teaching," she said finally. "You know more than I do about all of it. The metal, the mounting, the physics. People would listen to you." "People are listening to you. That is the point." Kvame turned to face her. "I could stand in the mercantile and explain radiant reflection until my voice gave out and no one would care. You stood in a shack with 2 children and survived a siege that should have killed you, and now everyone wants to know how." He paused. "The story matters more than the science. You are the story." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond the technical details of tin and heat. Kavame had given her tools, but she had given the tools meaning. Neither could have succeeded without the other. "Will you keep teaching me?" Ragna asked. "For as long as I can." Kavame picked up his tool roll and moved toward the door. "But you should know I am not young anymore. This winter took something out of me that I do not think will come back. When I am gone, you will have to carry what we built alone." "Do not speak like that. I speak like a man who has learned to count his remaining seasons." He paused at the door. "You will be fine, Ragna Tveit. You will be more than fine. Just remember that the best gift is not the one you give, but the one you teach others to give themselves." He left. The door closed behind him, and Ragna stood alone in the warm room, feeling the weight of what he had said settling over her like a blanket. The thaw came slowly that year. March brought warmer days interrupted by cold snaps, the temperature swinging wildly as winter fought to hold its grip. The snow retreated in stages, revealing the damage it had caused, collapsed sheds, dead livestock, the wreckage of a season that had pushed everyone to their limits. Ragna's shack had survived intact. The tin panels showed some warping from repeated heating, but the mounting had held, and the wall behind them bore no sign of charring. When she took the panels down to inspect the boards, Kavame had taught her to do this every few weeks. She found the wood sound and healthy, protected by the air gap that had prevented heat from building against the surface. She had used less fuel than any comparable shelter in the county. She could not prove this with certainty. No one had kept careful records, but the evidence was strong. Families with more wood had run out sooner. Families with better-built houses had burned through their supplies faster. The mathematics that should have killed her had been altered just enough, and the alteration had made all the difference. Kvama died in the 3rd week of March. It happened quietly, the way such things often do. He had been feeling poorly for several days, tired, short of breath, unwilling to walk as far as Ragna's shack. On the morning of the 19th, a neighbor found him in his rented room in town, still in his bed, his tool roll open beside him as if he had been preparing to work. Ragna heard the news from Marta, who came by with her face gray and her voice unsteady. "He was working on something when he died," Marta said. "A piece of tin bent into a curve. The neighbors said it looked like one of your panels, but smaller." "He was making something for the schoolhouse," Ragna said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat and distant. "He told me last week. He wanted to see if the principal could work in a larger room with more people. He never finished it." "No, he never did." The funeral was small. Kavam had no family in the territory, no one to mourn him, except the people who had known him briefly in his final months. Ragna stood at the grave with the children beside her and listened to the preacher speak words that meant nothing about a man the preacher had never met. When it was over, she walked to Kavame's rented room and collected his tools. The neighbor who had found him had no use for them, and no one else had claimed them. The leather roll was worn soft from decades of handling. The shears were sharp. The folding snips, the ones that had made her own look like children's toys, fit her hand as if they had been made for her. She carried them back to the shack and set them beside her own tools, and then she sat down in the chair by the stove and cried the way she had cried when Mikhail's fever broke. Silently, her face pressed into her hands, her shoulders shaking. The children watched her from the bed, uncertain what to do. Inga started to rise, but Ragne held up a hand. "I am all right," she said, though she was not. "I am just saying goodbye to a friend." That night, after the children were asleep, Ragna took the unfinished panel Kvamme had been making and examined it in the lamplight. It was beautiful work, cleaner than anything she could produce, the curves precise, the edges folded with a craftsman's care. He had been trying to solve the problem of a larger space, multiple heat sources, the geometry of warmth in a room built for many instead of few. She would finish it. Not tonight, not this week, but soon. She would finish what Kvamme had started, and she would take it to the schoolhouse, and she would teach anyone who wanted to learn. That was the gift he had left her. Not just the tools and the knowledge, but the understanding that both were worthless unless they were passed on. The stove crackled. The tin panel caught the light and threw it back. And somewhere in the room, warmth reached farther than it had any right to reach, the ghost of a man who had spent his life working with heat and metal, still doing his work even now. In the end, he had not saved her. He had taught her to save herself, which was a greater thing by far. And she would spend the rest of her life teaching others the same lesson, not because she owed him a debt, but because she finally understood what debts were for. The secondary crisis came in early April. A late blizzard swept through the county, not as severe as the January storms, but severe enough to trap people who had let their guard down, who had believed winter was finally over. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours, and the wind drove snow horizontally across the prairie like a white curtain being pulled across the world. The schoolhouse in De Smet had been serving as a community shelter for families who lived too far from town to travel safely. When the blizzard hit, there were 32 people inside, men, women, and children from a dozen different claims, huddled around a single cast-iron stove that could not keep the entire room warm. Ragna heard about it from a rider who had fought through the storm to reach the outer claims with warnings. The schoolhouse stove was consuming fuel at a terrifying rate. The building was larger than any private home, with high ceilings and gaps in the plank walls that let cold pour in. At the current burn rate, they would run out of wood before the storm passed. "They need help," the rider said. "Anyone who can reach them, anything you can bring." Ragna looked at the storm outside, at the visibility that ended 10 feet from her door. She looked at her children, at the warm room, at the supplies she had carefully rebuilt since the siege. "I cannot carry fuel through this," she said. "I have no team. Then there is nothing, but I might be able to help them use what they have." She told Inga to stay with Mikkel, to keep the fire going, to not open the door for anyone she did not recognize. Then she wrapped herself in every layer she owned, took Kvamme's tool roll and the unfinished panel he had been making, and stepped out into the blizzard. The walk to town should have taken an hour. It took 3. She crawled when she could not walk, followed fence posts when she could not see, and twice fell into drifts so deep she thought she would not climb out. But she kept moving. The people in the schoolhouse were burning through fuel they did not have, trying to heat a room that was bleeding warmth through every wall and window and gap. She reached the schoolhouse as the afternoon light began to fail. The building loomed out of the white, a dark shape with snow piled against its walls and smoke rising thin from its chimney. She pounded on the door until someone opened it. Inside was chaos. 32 people crowded into a single room, some pressed against the stove, others shivering in corners that the heat could not reach. The stove was roaring. Someone was overfeeding it, throwing in fuel as fast as it would burn, the heat pouring upward and outward in all directions while most of the room stayed cold. A man named Eriksson, who seemed to be in charge, looked at Ragna as if she had lost her mind. "You walked through that?" he said. "Alone?" "I walked through worse in January." Ragna set down the tool roll and looked around the room, assessing. The stove sat near the center, good for some applications, bad for others. The walls were single-thickness plank with no banking. The ceiling was high, which meant warm air was rising and pooling uselessly above everyone's heads. "You are burning too fast." "We are burning what we have to. Half these people are freezing." "They are freezing because you are heating the ceiling and the walls. The people are sitting below the warmth and beyond its reach." Ragna unrolled Kavame's tools and held up the unfinished panel. "I need metal. Any bright metal you can find. Tin, sheet iron, anything that reflects light instead of absorbing it." They thought she was mad. She could see it in their faces, the widow who had survived the siege through luck or stubbornness, now asking them to trust her with their lives during another storm. But there was nothing else to try, and desperation made people willing to listen. They found metal, a piece of roofing scrap, a sheet of tin that had been used to repair a window frame, the bright surface of a damaged serving tray that someone had brought as part of their supplies, not enough for a proper installation, but enough to demonstrate. Ragna worked fast. She positioned the largest piece behind the stove, angling it to throw heat toward the corner where the children sat. She mounted a smaller piece on the opposite side, redirecting warmth that had been pouring into an empty wall. She showed Erickson how to bank the fire instead of overfeeding it, how to let coals build heat slowly instead of burning wood fast and hot. The effect was not dramatic. It was not a miracle. But within an hour, the temperature in the occupied parts of the room had risen noticeably, while the fuel consumption had dropped. Children who had been shivering were now merely cold. Adults who had been pressed against the stove could sit back and make room for others. "It is not enough to save everyone if the storm lasts another 3 days," Ragna said, "but it might be enough to save everyone if the storm lasts 1 more day." "1 more day is all we need," Erickson said. He looked at her with an expression she had seen before, the look of someone realizing that their understanding of the world was incomplete. "Where did you learn this?" "From a man who worked on steamboats, and from my father who warmed his workshop with a piece of scrap metal." "Can you teach us?" "Properly, I mean, so we can do it ourselves next time?" Ragna looked around the schoolhouse at the 32 faces watching her, frightened, cold, hopeful. She thought of Kavame and his unfinished panel, of Marta learning to mount her own sheets, of all the people who had come to her shack asking to understand. "Yes," she said, "I can teach you." The storm broke the next morning. The people in the schoolhouse survived, and when they returned to their claims, they carried with them not just the memory of a terrible night, but the knowledge of a woman who had walked through a blizzard to show them a different way to stay warm. Silas Brund heard about the schoolhouse incident within days. He heard about it from customers who could not stop talking about the widow Tveit and her tin panels. He heard about it from competitors who wondered whether there was money to be made selling reflective metal to homesteaders. He heard about it from men who had stood in his store and laughed at the shiny wall, now asking whether he stocked the kind of bright tin that worked best. Ragna did not know any of this. She only knew that when she came to the mercantile in mid-April to buy flour and lamp oil, Brund looked at her differently than he had before. "Mrs. Tveit," he said. His voice had lost some of its familiar smoothness. "I understand you have been busy." "I have been surviving, same as everyone else." "Not the same as everyone else, from what I hear. I hear you walk 3 miles through the worst storm of the year to save 30 people with nothing but scrap metal and stubbornness." "I walked 3 miles through a storm to help some neighbors. The scrap metal helped. So did the stubbornness." Brun was quiet for a moment. He rang up her purchases slowly, as if he were thinking about something else. "I offered you $45 for your claim last October," he said. "Do you remember?" "I remember." "It is worth considerably more than that now. The land, I mean. The improvements you have made, the shelter, the reputation, the people who know your name. He looked up at her. I would offer you $200 today. Cash. Ragna felt something cold move through her stomach. $200 was more money than she had ever held at one time. It was enough to take the children east, to start over somewhere with real walls and real fuel supplies, and neighbors who did not require teaching to survive. It was also the measure of how much her refusal had cost Silas Brund. He had expected her to fail. He had expected to buy her claim for nothing after she died or surrendered. Instead, she had survived, and worse, she had taught others how to survive, which meant fewer desperate families selling their land to men like him. The claim is not for sale, she said. Everything is for sale at the right price. Not this. Not ever. Brun's expression shifted, the smooth mask slipping slightly, revealing something harder underneath. You have made a mistake, Mrs. Tveit. You have given away for free what you could have sold for profit. Every family you teach is a family that does not need to buy more fuel from me. Every technique you share is money out of my pocket. I did not realize that keeping people alive was bad for your business. Keeping people alive is excellent for my business. Keeping people alive and dependent is even better. What you are doing, teaching them to need less, that is bad for my business. He handed her the flour and lamp oil. You have made enemies today that you do not even know about. Men who profit from desperation do not appreciate those who reduce desperation. Then those men should find a better way to make their living. Brun smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Tveit. I mean that sincerely. You have accomplished something I did not think possible, and you have done it while making me look like a fool. He leaned forward across the counter. But winters end and summers pass, and eventually another winter comes. And when it does, we will see whether your remarkable accomplishments can survive the attention of men who wish you had failed. Ragna took her supplies and left without responding, but she felt his eyes on her back as she walked out, and she understood that something had changed. She had survived the winter. She had taught others to survive, and in doing so, she had made herself a target for people who prospered from the fear and desperation she was working to reduce. The victory was real, but it was not complete, and the cost of what she had done was only beginning to become clear. Spring arrived properly in May. The snow melted. The ground thawed. Ragna walked her claim for the first time since October, seeing it not as she remembered it, but as it actually was, larger than it had seemed when she was trapped inside the shack, more promising than it had felt during the darkest nights of the siege. The children ran ahead of her through the tall grass, laughing at nothing, delighted to be outside after months of confinement. Mikkel had recovered fully from his fever, though he tired more easily than before. Inga had grown somehow during the winter, not taller, but older in her face and her eyes, and she looked at the world with an awareness that had not been there in October. They had all grown, they had all changed, and the claim that had seemed like a death sentence 6 months ago now felt like something worth fighting for. Ragna stood at the edge of the property, looking south toward the horizon, where other claims stretched out like a patchwork quilt of hope and ambition. Somewhere out there, families were using techniques she had taught them. Somewhere out there, tin panels caught the light behind cast iron stoves. She thought of Anders, buried on the south edge of the claim. She thought of Kvame, buried in the town cemetery with strangers. She thought of all the people who had doubted her, dismissed her, tried to buy her surrender, and of all the people who had learned from her, adopted her methods, passed the knowledge forward. She thought of Silas Brund and his warning about men who wished she had failed, and she thought of the children running through the grass ahead of her, alive because a piece of bright metal had caught the firelight, and thrown it back into a room where it was needed. The winter was over, but the work was just beginning. The summer of 1881 passed in a blur of work and rebuilding. Ragna repaired the damage the winter had done to her shack, replacing boards that had warped, reinforcing the sod banking, patching gaps in the tar paper that she had been too exhausted to fix during the siege. The children helped where they could, Inga proving surprisingly capable with a hammer, and Mikkel finding ways to be useful that did not require the strength his illness had taken. But the real work was not on her own claim. The real work was everywhere else. By midsummer, Ragna had helped install reflective panels in 11 homes across the county. Some were simple, a single sheet of bright tin behind a stove, mounted with proper spacing. Others were more complex, multiple panels arranged to catch heat from different angles, curved wings to direct warmth toward sleeping areas, modifications adapted to the specific shape and layout of each dwelling. She kept notes. Kvamme had taught her to do this, to record what worked and what did not, to track the relationship between panel size and room dimensions, to notice patterns that might not be obvious until you saw them written down. The notes filled a small ledger that she carried with her to every installation, adding observations, refining techniques, building a body of knowledge that grew more useful with each application. The teaching was harder than the building. Some people understood immediately. They saw the principle heat going where you directed it instead of where it wanted to go, and they could apply it to their own situations without much guidance. These were the ones who became teachers themselves, spreading the knowledge outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Others struggled. They could follow instructions, could mount a panel exactly as Ragna showed them, but they could not adapt when circumstances changed. When their stove was positioned differently than hers, when their walls were made of different materials, when the shape of their room demanded a different approach, they did not know what to do. For these people, Ragna learned to teach not just the technique, but the thinking behind it. Why did bright metal reflect heat? Why did spacing matter? Why did the angle of the curve change what happened to the warmth? The why was harder to explain than the how, but the people who understood the why could solve problems she had never anticipated. A man named Solberg figured out how to use a piece of polished copper to direct heat toward a corner where his elderly mother sat. A woman named Christie discovered that placing a small panel near the stovepipe captured warmth that had been escaping upward and threw it back down into the room. A family with 6 children and a shack barely larger than Ragna's developed a system of movable panels that could be repositioned depending on where everyone was sitting. Each innovation surprised her. Each innovation proved that the knowledge she was sharing was not a fixed thing, but a living one, capable of growing and changing in ways she could not predict. By autumn, she had lost count of how many people were using some version of the method. The county had perhaps 200 homesteading families spread across its territory. At least 60 of them had tin panels behind their stoves, and more were building every week. Silas Brun watched all of this with growing frustration. He had tried to profit from the trend at first, buying up bright tin and selling it at inflated prices. But the homesteaders learned quickly that any reflective metal would work: old roofing scrap, polished sheet iron, even the bright lids of discarded canning pots. The materials were everywhere if you knew what to look for, and Ragna taught everyone what to look for. His fuel sales dropped. Not dramatically, people still needed wood to burn, but noticeably. Families that had purchased 6 cords the previous year bought 5. Families that had bought 5 bought 4. The mathematics of desperation that Brund had built his business on were changing, and he did not know how to change them back. Ragna heard about his anger from others. She heard that he blamed her publicly, called her a meddler who was destroying honest commerce. She heard that he had tried to convince other merchants to refuse her credit, to freeze her out of the local economy the way he froze out competitors. She heard that he had spoken to the territorial surveyor about irregularities in her filing, a desperate attempt to find some legal means of taking what he had failed to purchase. None of it worked. The surveyor found no irregularities. The merchants who had seen her methods, adopted by their own families, refused to turn against her. And the community that had once laughed at the widow with the shiny wall now defended her as fiercely as they defended their own kin. Bruin's opportunity came in late November. Another early winter, another series of storms, another stretch of bitter cold that tested everyone's preparations. Most families were better equipped than they had been the previous year. Most had panels installed, fuel stored, knowledge ready. But Brund had neither. He had spent the autumn trying to undermine Ragna instead of preparing for winter. He had assumed that his wealth would protect him, that he could always buy whatever he needed, that his position in town made him immune to the ordinary dangers that threatened homesteaders. He was wrong. The storm that struck on the 20th of November was not the worst of the season, but it was bad enough. It trapped Brund in his store when the building next door caught fire from an overturned lamp. The fire spread quickly in the dry cold, jumping to the mercantile's roof before anyone could stop it. Brund escaped with his life, but lost most of his inventory, his living quarters above the store, and the comfortable assumptions that had sustained him. He spent that night in the schoolhouse with 40 other refugees from the fire, the same schoolhouse where Ragna had improvised an installation the previous spring. The tin panels she had mounted were still there, still catching the stove's heat and throwing it back into the room. The same principle she had given away for free was now keeping Silas Brund alive. Ragna was not there that night. She heard about it later from multiple sources who all told the same story with variations in detail, but agreement on the essential point. Brund had sat in the warmth of that schoolhouse, in comfort created by the woman he had tried to destroy, and he had said nothing for hours. He had watched the panels catch the firelight. He had felt the heat reach him in a corner of the room that should have been cold. And when morning came and people began to leave, he had stopped one of the other refugees, a man named Lindgren, the same man who had brought fuel to Ragna's shack during the siege, and asked a question. Where did she learn to do this? From her father, Lindgren said, and from a tinsmith named Kvame, who taught her the rest. And she gave it away, all of it, for nothing? Lindgren had looked at Brund with an expression that held no sympathy and no anger, only the flat certainty of someone stating an obvious truth. She gave it away because that is what you do with things that save lives. You do not sell them. You do not hoard them. You give them to anyone who needs them, and you hope they will do the same. Brund had not responded, but a week later, when his store was being rebuilt and his affairs were being sorted, he had made a donation to the schoolhouse, enough money to properly insulate the walls and install permanent reflective panels designed according to Ragna's specifications. It was not an apology. He never apologized. But it was an acknowledgement, and in Kingsbury County, that was almost the same thing. Peter Lund arrived in the spring of 1882. He was a carpenter by trade, a widower by circumstance, and a man who had heard about the woman teaching heat management to homesteaders while he was working on a rail depot 3 counties east. He had not believed the stories at first. They sounded too strange, too much like the exaggerated tales that frontier people told to pass long winters. But he had also noticed that the stories were consistent, that they came from multiple sources who did not know each other, and that they all agreed on the essential details. A woman, tin panels, heat that went where you wanted it instead of where it wanted to go. He came to see for himself. Ragna was working on a new installation when he found her, a cabin belonging to a family named Haugen, who had just arrived from Minnesota with 3 children and no understanding of what Dakota winters demanded. She was explaining the spacing principle to Mrs. Haugen while mounting the main panel. her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done this work many times. Peter stood in the doorway and watched without announcing himself. He watched her measure the air gap with a piece of scrap wood. He watched her test the angle by holding her palm near the surface and feeling the warmth reflect back. He watched her adjust the mounting bolts with Kavame's shears, the tools moving in her hands as if they belonged there. "You know what you're doing," he said finally. Ragna turned, startled. She had not heard him approach. "I know some of what I am doing," she said. "I am still learning the rest." "You mounted that panel with a half-inch gap at the top and 3/4 at the bottom. The angle directs heat downward into the room instead of letting it rise to the ceiling." He stepped closer, examining her work. "That is not something you figure out by accident. Someone taught you." "A man named Kavame. He worked on lake steamers before the railroads killed the trade." "I knew a Kavame once, in Duluth, maybe 15 years ago. Older man, missing the tip of one finger." Ragna felt something shift in her chest. "Yes, that was him. He was the best metalworker I ever saw. He could make tin do things that seemed impossible." Peter looked at her with new interest. "He taught you his trade?" "He taught me what I needed to survive. The trade came with it." Peter nodded slowly. He moved to the panel she had just mounted and ran his fingers along the edge, testing the fold, checking the spacing the way Kavame had taught her to check it. "This is good work," he said. "Professional work. Better than most paid installations I have seen." "I do not charge for it." "I know. That is part of why I came." He turned to face her directly. "I am a carpenter. I build houses, frame barns, do finish work when people can afford it. I heard there was a woman out here who was teaching people to make their shelters more efficient, and I wanted to see whether the technique could be integrated into new construction." "Integrated how?" "Built in from the beginning, instead of mounting panels after the house is finished, designing the house so the panels are part of the structure. Better placement, better spacing, better results." Ragna had not thought of this. She had been working with existing buildings, retrofitting solutions to problems that already existed. The idea of building the solution into the structure itself, of designing houses that worked with heat instead of against it, opened possibilities she had not considered. That would require someone who understood both the carpentry and the heat management, she said. Yes, it would. Peter met her eyes. I understand the carpentry. You understand the heat. Together, we might understand the whole. It was not a proposal of marriage. It was not even, properly speaking, a proposal of partnership. It was a statement of possibility, an observation that two people with complementary knowledge might accomplish things that neither could accomplish alone. Ragna looked at this man she had just met, this carpenter who had heard stories and come to see for himself, and she recognized something in his face that she had seen in Kavame's, the expression of someone who cared more about whether something worked than about who got credit for it. I have 2 children, she said, and a claim to prove up, and more requests for help than I can answer. I have nothing but my tools and a wagon, Peter said, and more time than I know what to do with. Then perhaps you should stay and see whether the technique can be integrated into new construction. Peter smiled. It was a careful smile, tentative, the smile of a man who had learned not to expect too much. Perhaps I should, he said. He stayed. The partnership developed slowly, through shared work rather than shared words. Peter built a small addition to Ragna's shack, a proper workshop where she could bend and cut metal without taking up space in the main room. Ragna taught him the principles Kavame had taught her, watching as he translated them into carpentry terms, integrated them into framing plans, developed specifications for houses that would work with heat instead of against it. They built their first fully integrated house in the summer of 1882, a cabin for a young couple who had just filed on a claim west of town. The reflective panels were part of the wall structure, mounted during construction with proper spacing built in. The stove position was planned around the panels instead of the other way around. The result was a dwelling that needed 30% less fuel than comparable buildings, according to Ragna's careful measurements. The young couple spread the word. Other families wanted the same thing. Peter began getting requests for new construction that specifically included Ragna's heat management system, and within a year, they were working together on nearly every project. The marriage came later, 2 years after they met, after the children had grown accustomed to Peter's presence, after the partnership had proven itself through shared labor and shared purpose. It was a quiet ceremony, witnessed by Marta Neschheim and a few other neighbors who had known Ragna since the beginning. Elias Hofde attended, standing at the back of the small church, and afterward he shook Peter's hand and told him he was marrying the most stubborn woman in the territory. "I know," Peter said. "That is why I asked her." The years that followed compressed into a rhythm of work and family and gradual improvement. Ragna's shack became a proper house, framed by Peter, heated by the integrated system they had developed together. A daughter was born in 1884, named Torsten, after the man who had taught Ragna to work with metal. A son followed in 1886, named Anders, after the husband Ragna had buried before everything began. The claim was proved up and patented. The land that had seemed like a death sentence became the foundation of a life. And everywhere across the county, in houses and cabins and shanties of every description, tin panels caught the firelight and threw it back into rooms where families sat farther from their stoves than physics suggested they should be able to sit. Ragna continued teaching until her hands could no longer hold the shears. The knowledge spread beyond Kingsbury County, carried by people who moved to new territories and took what they had learned with them. She heard reports from Nebraska, from Montana, from places she had never seen, all describing variations on the technique she had developed in desperation during the worst winter of her life. Some of the variations were improvements, some were mistakes, but all of them traced back to a widow with 2 children and a sheet of corrugated tin standing in a 12 by 16-foot shack and wondering whether there was any variable she had not yet considered. Peter died in 1904 of a heart that simply stopped one afternoon while he was planing boards in the workshop he had built for Ragna 22 years earlier. She found him there, slumped over his bench, his tools still arranged in the order he liked them. She did not remarry. She did not need to. The life they had built together continued in the house he had framed, in the children they had raised, in the work that carried both their contributions forward. The children grew and scattered. Inga married a school teacher and moved to Sioux Falls. Mikkel, fully recovered from the fever that had nearly killed him, became a doctor who specialized in treating conditions of the chest and lungs. Little Torsten, who was not little anymore, took over the family land and worked it with her own husband. Anders, the youngest, went east to study engineering and never came back to the prairie except for visits. Ragna stayed. The land was hers. The house was hers. And somewhere in the shed behind the workshop, carefully preserved, the first warped tin panel she had ever mounted still leaned against the wall, too bent to use, too important to throw away. She died in the winter of 1912, at 73 years old, in the house Peter had built around a heating system they had designed together. The stove was burning when they found her, the panels catching the firelight, the room warm in every corner. Her obituary in the De Smet newspaper mentioned her work with heat management. It called her a pioneer in practical home improvement, and noted that variations on her method were in use across the northern plains. It did not mention Kavame by name, though Ragna would have wanted it to. It did not mention the night she had climbed onto a buried threshold to clear a stovepipe in a screaming wind, It did not mention Silas Brund or his grudging donation to the schoolhouse or the look on his face when he realized he owed his life to a woman he had tried to destroy. Obituaries rarely contain the whole truth. They contain the parts that fit in columns of newsprint, arranged to make the dead seem complete. But the whole truth lived on in the people she had taught, in the houses that stayed warm, in the knowledge that passed from hand to hand like a gift that never stopped giving. By the time Ragna Tveit was buried beside her first husband on the south edge of the claim, more than 200 families in the Dakota Territories had learned some version of the method she had developed during the hard winter of 1880 to 81. The knowledge had spread through teaching and imitation, through shared desperation and shared survival, until it became part of how people built and heated their homes in a land that had tried its best to kill them. He had stood in her doorway with snow on his shoulders and judgment on his face, and he had said the words that were supposed to make her surrender. When the first true storm shuts the road, that wall will warm no child. But the storm had come, and the road had shut, and the wall had warmed 2 children and a widow who refused to believe the mathematics of desperation were the only mathematics that existed. The shiny wall that everyone laughed at had held through the worst siege in territorial memory, and the woman who built it had spent the rest of her life teaching others to build their own, the same room, the same stove. But this time, the children sat back from the iron with red cheeks instead of gray hands, the bright metal behind the stove flickering like a second fire that burned no wood. And outside, the prairie wind still blew, and the snow still fell, and the cold still killed those who did not prepare. But in the houses where the knowledge had taken root, the warmth reached farther than it had any right to reach, and the fuel lasted longer than the mathematics suggested it should, and the people who had learned survived to teach others who survived to teach others still. The prairie took what it could from Ragna Tveit. It took her first husband and her mentor, and years of her life spent fighting conditions that should have been unsurvivable. But that winter, the winter everyone said would kill her, it could not take the heat she taught a wall to return.